He stood up in court. No lawyer, no fear. "My name is Elijah Grant. I was deputy director of the FBI." The crooked cops who laughed seconds ago turned ghost white. But that was just the beginning. What happened next will shock even the most jaded. Let's start from the beginning.
You think court battles are crazy? Wait until you hear about the 75-year-old woman pregnant by her 19-year-old husband. It's not just a scandal. It's a shock. Society, family, friends, everyone's stunned by their story. At one point, they were ready to give up, but they didn't. How did their love survive all the obstacles? Click the suggestion to find out how this surprising story unfolds. Don't miss out on a love that defies every stereotype.
The courtroom was too cold for a spring morning. Artificial lighting buzzed overhead as the smell of old paper, burnt coffee, and floor polish lingered in the air. Rows of stiff wooden benches held bored spectators, a few murmuring quietly, others scrolling through their phones. But in the front row, just behind the prosecution's table, two men in uniform sat like they owned the room. Detective Rick Lawson leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his badge glinting under the lights. He had a receding hairline, tired eyes, and a smug grin that rarely left his face. Next to him sat Sergeant Jake Monroe, broad-shouldered, cocky, with slicked-back hair and a laugh that carried just a little too far. He nudged Lawson with an elbow, whispering something before both broke into stifled chuckles. "Look at him," Monroe muttered, glancing toward the defendant's table. "Can't believe they dressed him in a damn suit." Lawson grinned. "Dead man walking." At the defense table sat Elijah Grant, his hands cuffed in front of him, resting motionless on the polished wood. Early 50s, clean-shaven except for a neatly trimmed beard with flecks of gray. Black suit, white shirt, no tie. Calm. Controlled. The kind of composure that made jurors nervous, like they weren't sure whether to pity him or fear him. The charges were read aloud by the prosecutor, a young, overconfident man named Travis Bell. Possession with intent to distribute, assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. Each count landed like a punch, but Elijah didn't flinch, not once. The jury sat quietly, 12 strangers trying not to meet anyone's eyes. Some scribbled notes, some leaned forward, intrigued. Others glanced at Elijah with cautious judgment. It didn't help that Bell projected confidence. He paced as he spoke, gesturing toward exhibits on a projector screen, blurry photos, call logs, alleged surveillance stills. He pointed at one grainy photo. "Here's Mr. Grant exchanging cash with a known dealer in a parking lot outside a liquor store." Then to another, showing the interior of a car. "And here, bags of fentanyl discovered under the passenger seat of his vehicle, street value estimated at over $40,000. The courtroom rustled. Someone in the back let out a soft whistle. Lawson smirked and leaned over again. "You see the look on that juror's face? He's toast." "They always break," Monroe added. "First time in cuffs, always the same." But Elijah didn't break. His eyes scanned the courtroom slowly, calm, focused, observing. The judge, a stern woman named Judith McMillan, banged her gavel for order. "Let's maintain decorum," she said, glancing toward the officers' row. Lawson and Monroe straightened their faces, barely concealing their amusement. Elijah's court-appointed attorney, Sarah Kim, shifted nervously in her seat. Young, mid-20s, fresh out of law school. She'd drawn the short straw for this case. At least, that's what everyone whispered. The girl who got stuck defending a man the cops swore was a drug runner. She kept flipping through her notes, lips pressed tight, avoiding eye contact with the jury. She looked like she didn't sleep last night. She probably hadn't. When the prosecution rested its opening statement, Sarah rose, clearly unsure of herself. "Your Honor, the defense will show," she cleared her throat, "that Mr. Grant is innocent of all charges, and the evidence will demonstrate serious inconsistencies in the officers' accounts. Snickers rippled from the back of the room. Lawson and Monroe exchanged a glance that said, "She's in way over her head." Sarah sat down, visibly rattled. Elijah leaned toward her slightly, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "Don't panic. Let them dig their own grave." His voice was steady, almost too calm. Sarah blinked. Was that confidence? Or delusion? Outside the courtroom, rain started to fall in slow, cold drops. Reporters gathered at the front steps, flashing cameras and murmuring over headlines. High-profile arrest tied to city drug ring. Former military man behind bars. The narrative had already formed. The cops had made sure of that. Inside, the courtroom carried the illusion of order, but underneath, tension simmered. The jury was being pulled in different directions. Authority figures in uniform smiled as they were praised by the prosecution. The defendant, in contrast, sat like a shadow, silent, unreadable, and above all, alone. Until one moment shifted everything, almost imperceptibly. When the court recessed for lunch, Monroe stood near the hallway, talking too loudly on purpose. "Guy was twitching like a junkie when we booked him. Should have seen him cry." Elijah walked past, flanked by two bailiffs. He turned his head slightly toward Monroe and said, "Funny, I don't recall crying, but I do remember your body cam being mysteriously turned off." Monroe froze for a second. Not long, but long enough for Sarah to notice. Elijah was watching, calculating, letting them hang themselves, but no one else saw it. Yet. And upstairs, in a sealed federal office, a flash drive labeled Operation Iron Mirror sat in a locked safe, waiting to be introduced. The officers laughed as the courtroom reconvened. They thought it was over. They thought they'd already won. They didn't know they were sitting on the edge of a cliff, and they were about to fall. The courtroom returned from recess with a quiet hum of movement, jurors adjusting in their seats, the gallery whispering behind raised hands. Sarah Kim nervously smoothing her skirt before sitting back down. The fluorescent lights still hummed, and so did the air of false certainty that filled the room. But if the audience was beginning to feel a shift in tone, the prosecution didn't seem to notice. The bailiff called the first witness, Sergeant Jake Monroe. He rose from the front row and walked confidently to the stand. His uniform was pristine, medals polished, sleeves crisp, his hair gelled and parted like he was posing for a recruitment poster. Once seated and sworn in, Monroe gave the jury a practiced smile. He leaned toward the mic like he owned it. "Sergeant Monroe," Prosecutor Bell began, "you were one of the arresting officers the night Mr. Grant was taken into custody. Could you walk us through what happened?" Monroe nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. We received a tip about a suspected drug exchange taking place in a liquor store parking lot on 8th and Redwood. I arrived on the scene with Detective Lawson. We observed the defendant, Mr. Grant, speaking with a known dealer. We witnessed a handoff. Then Mr. Grant entered his vehicle and began driving away. We followed, initiated a stop, and upon searching the car, found 2 packages of fentanyl under the passenger seat." "Did Mr. Grant resist arrest?" "He became aggressive, verbally confrontational, refused to exit the vehicle and had to be removed physically." The jury nodded slightly, absorbing it all. On the other side of the room, Lawson looked on with the smug satisfaction of a man who'd already buried the body and planted flowers on top. "And did you recognize the defendant at the time?" Bell asked. Monroe hesitated for the briefest of seconds. "No, sir. We ran his ID afterward." "No suspicion that he was law enforcement?" Another pause, just long enough for someone observant to notice. "None at all." Sarah Kim stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculative." "Sustained," Judge McMillan said, barely looking up. Sarah sat again, jaw tight. Prosecutor Bell smiled and finished. No further questions. Defense? The judge asked. Sarah slowly rose, clutching her legal pad with white knuckles. Sergeant Monroe, how long have you worked in narcotics enforcement? 8 years, he said confidently. And how many arrests would you say you've made in that time? He shrugged. Hundreds. So, in hundreds of arrests, you've never encountered anyone with federal law enforcement credentials? Not in a situation like this, no. Sarah nodded, walking a few steps away. Is it normal to turn off your body camera during a stop? Monroe blinked. I didn't turn it off, it malfunctioned. She raised an eyebrow. Both yours and Detective Lawson's malfunctioned during the same stop? Yes. She paused. Convenient. Objection, Bell snapped. Sustained. Sarah pressed on. Did you see the alleged fentanyl exchange clearly from your patrol car? Yes. You were parked across a 4-lane street and observed a hand-to-hand transaction at night through a tinted car window? I have good eyes. Murmurs bubbled from the gallery. Judge McMillan banged her gavel. One more outburst and I'll clear the room. Sarah sat down, visibly frustrated. She knew Monroe's answers didn't hold, but the jury wasn't fully convinced yet. Then came Detective Lawson. He swaggered to the stand like a man being honored, not questioned. He adjusted his collar and offered the jury a grandfatherly smile before launching into his version of events. It was nearly identical to Monroe's. Same parking lot, same narrative, same violent reaction from Elijah. And what was the defendant's demeanor during the arrest? Bell asked. Hostile? Arrogant. He refused to comply, cursed at us, made threats. Did he identify himself as a federal agent? Not until after we booked him. Bell smiled as if that detail sealed the case. So he resisted, he lied, and he only played the badge card once the drugs were found? Correct. Sarah stood again, slower this time. Detective Lawson, were you aware of any complaints filed against you for misconduct? Bell stood. Objection. Irrelevant. Your Honor, Sarah pushed. The defense believes the arresting officer's credibility is crucial. If he has a pattern of misconduct, approach the bench, the judge ordered. Both attorneys approached in hushed tones. After a moment, Judge McMillan sighed, then turned to the courtroom. I will allow limited questioning on prior conduct. Be careful, Ms. Kim. Sarah returned to her podium. Detective Lawson, are you currently under investigation for 2 other cases involving planted evidence? Lawson's jaw tensed. Those are unsubstantiated allegations. But they exist. Internal Affairs hasn't found any wrongdoing. And yet those 2 defendants were acquitted. Objection, Bell barked. Sustained. Sarah let the moment hang before moving on. Isn't it true, Detective, that your cruiser's dash cam was also mysteriously disabled during Mr. Grant's arrest? Tech failure. So every piece of departmental equipment assigned to you failed at once. Body cams, dash cam, audio feed? Like I said, malfunction. Sarah leaned back, her voice steady now. Or maybe the only thing malfunctioning was the truth. A quiet gasp rose from someone in the gallery. The judge narrowed her eyes. Miss Kim, that's your one warning. Sarah nodded, withdrawing. She'd scored a hit, but it was still just a scratch. As Lawson stepped down, he shot Elijah a glance. That same smug, rehearsed superiority, like he was still in control. But Elijah wasn't watching him. He was watching the jury, watching them squirm, shift, murmur. Doubt had entered the room like smoke under a locked door. It was slow, but it was spreading. The judge called for another recess. Bailiffs led Elijah out in cuffs again, even though he walked like a free man. Sarah followed him down the hallway, still unsure whether to feel hope or dread. You think it's working? She asked quietly. Elijah gave her the smallest nod. "They don't know it yet," he said, "but they're already caught." Back in the courtroom, Lawson and Monroe sat down again. Monroe leaned in. "Think he's bluffing?" Lawson didn't answer, because for the first time, he wasn't so sure. The courtroom was quieter now, not because things had calmed, but because something had shifted. It was subtle, like a tremor before an earthquake. The prosecution had just called forensics, paraded photos of bagged fentanyl, and reinforced the chain of custody, all airtight on the surface. But when the defense rose again, something changed in the air. Sarah Kim walked toward the bench with a strange stillness. Her hands no longer trembled. Her voice no longer wavered. It was as if someone had flipped a switch inside her. Even Judge McMillan seemed to take note. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense calls Mrs. Loretta Boudreau to the stand." A shuffle of surprise moved through the gallery. This witness hadn't been on the pretrial list. The prosecution frowned, whispering furiously between themselves. From the side door, an elderly black woman stepped forward, short, with a slight limp, wearing a floral dress and holding a well-worn Bible. Her name had barely been introduced before she locked eyes with Elijah and gave the faintest nod. Once seated and sworn in, Sarah approached. "Mrs. Boudreau, where were you on the night of March 14th around 8 o'clock p.m.? "At home," she said, her voice slow but firm. "I live on Redwood, right across the street from that liquor store they keep talking about." "Did you see anyone outside the store that evening?" "I saw Mr. Grant," she said, pointing at Elijah. "He was walking his dog, a big golden retriever. Sweet boy. They walked right past my window." "Did you see him interacting with anyone?" "No, ma'am. He wasn't near no one, not even close. Just him and the dog." Sarah let that hang in the air before continuing. "And how far is your window from the sidewalk?" 8 feet, maybe 10. No further questions." Bell shot up from his seat. "Mrs. Boudreau, do you have any video footage of what you saw?" "I ain't got a security camera, if that's what you mean." "Then how can we be sure of your memory?" "I remember what I see, son. I may be old, but I'm not blind." A ripple of laughter from the gallery. Judge McMillan smiled faintly but held up her hand. "Order." Bell gritted his teeth. "No further questions." Sarah returned to the bench. "Your Honor, the defense would now like to submit surveillance footage from a municipal traffic cam on the corner of 6th and Redwood, facing northbound." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is this new evidence?" "It was obtained this morning. My office requested it directly from the Department of Transportation." Bell looked ready to object, but paused. "We'd like to see it as well, Your Honor." "Proceed," Judge McMillan said. The bailiff dimmed the lights. On screen, a wide-angle view of the sidewalk, a man in a dark suit walking a golden retriever. Timestamp, 8:07 p.m. Sarah turned to the jury. "That is Mr. Grant, approximately a block and a half away from the liquor store." The video rolled. No contact, no transactions, just a man walking his dog. Cut to a second clip, 8:10 p.m., the same man, now crossing the street. Still alone. Sarah pressed a key on her laptop. "Your Honor, the defense notes that the alleged drug exchange occurred at 8:09 per the prosecution's timeline." The courtroom was dead silent. Jurors exchanged glances. One of them, a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt, leaned forward as if trying to catch a detail he might have missed. Judge McMillan frowned. "Mr. Bell, was this footage provided to your office?" Bell stammered. It may have been overlooked." "Overlooked," Sarah repeated flatly. Elijah remained still, silent, watching. "Ms. Kim," the judge said, "please continue." "The defense also submits a screenshot of Officer Monroe's police report." Sarah clicked again. "In his report, he describes Mr. Grant wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. The footage clearly shows a dark suit and slacks. There is no hoodie. There are no genes. The room seemed to pull inward, like air being vacuumed into a black hole. The cop's narrative was cracking, and cracking fast. Bell tried to recover. One piece of video doesn't erase the drugs found in the car. Sarah nodded. That's true, but it does suggest that the entire premise for stopping Mr. Grant was fabricated, which means everything that followed, including the search, may have been illegal. Judge McMillan adjusted her glasses. That's for the jury to decide. Elijah leaned toward Sarah. It's time, he whispered. She looked at him. Time for what? He didn't answer, but his eyes told her. The setup was ending. The reveal was coming. As court adjourned for the day, the jurors shuffled out, clearly shaken. Some avoided eye contact with the prosecution. Others glanced at Elijah with a mix of curiosity and unease. In the hallway outside, reporters crowded behind barricades. Is the case falling apart? Will the charges be dropped? Who really is Elijah Grant? Lawson and Monroe exited through the side door, escorted by courthouse staff. Lawson lit a cigarette with shaky hands. You didn't tell me about that camera, Monroe snapped. You think I knew? Lawson shot back. D-out footage isn't supposed to sync with criminal intel. Well, it just did. Monroe glanced toward the main entrance. Cameras everywhere. Reporters circling like vultures. They're gonna eat us alive, he muttered. Lawson growled. Relax. They've still got the drugs. Chain of custody is clean. He can't prove a setup. But his voice didn't sound certain anymore, not like it did that morning. Sarah walked behind Elijah as he was led back to holding. Whatever you're planning, she whispered, you better make it quick. They're trying to close ranks. Elijah paused before entering the holding cell. They already did, he said. Now we pull the floor out from under them. And somewhere, far from the courthouse, an encrypted email triggered a release protocol. A 36-hour countdown had just begun. The truth wasn't just coming. It was already on its way. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Word had spread overnight. Something about a strange piece of footage, a surprise witness, a defense attorney who suddenly wasn't shaking anymore. People weren't just attending out of curiosity now. They came because they felt something was about to break. Reporters lined the gallery. Even the court sketch artist was working faster than usual. A local news anchor sat in the back row, whispering updates to a producer on the phone. Something was happening. Everyone felt it. Judge Judith McMillan took her seat, glancing at the clock. Court is now in session. Sarah Kim stood before she was even called. Her stance was calm, centered, nothing like the anxious intern from 2 days ago. Your Honor, she said clearly, the defense calls Mr. Elijah Grant to the stand. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Detective Lawson shifted in his seat. Sergeant Monroe stopped scratching his chin. Prosecutor Bell opened his mouth to object but froze when the judge spoke first. He's the defendant. He has every right to testify. Elijah stood slowly. No cuffs, no guards. Just a man walking to the witness box under the weight of something far bigger than any one person in the room understood. He was sworn in. He took his seat. Then Sarah approached. Mr. Grant, please state your full name and occupation for the record. Elijah looked directly at the jury. His voice was calm, clear, controlled. My name is Elijah David Grant. Until 3 months ago, I served as Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI Internal Affairs Division. The words detonated like a bomb. Gasps. Someone in the gallery dropped their coffee. One juror blinked like they hadn't heard him correctly. Even Judge McMillan sat straighter. Bell jumped to his feet. Your Honor, is this a joke? Some kind of stunt? It's not a stunt, Sarah interrupted. We have documentation. She walked to the bench and placed a leather folder in front of the judge. Inside, federal credentials, operation briefings, and signed authorization orders. The judge flipped through them, slowly, carefully, her face unreadable, until it wasn't. She looked up. "You may proceed." Elijah turned his attention back to the courtroom. 6 months ago, he said, the FBI received multiple complaints about officers in this precinct. Tampering with evidence, falsifying reports, targeting civilians for personal gain. The names that came up the most? Detective Rick Lawson and Sergeant Jake Monroe. Every eye turned to the two officers. Lawson didn't move. Monroe shifted in his seat, his leg suddenly bouncing. "In response," Elijah continued, "I volunteered for a high-risk integrity test, a sting operation. We called it Operation Iron Mirror. The objective was simple: embed an undercover federal officer, create plausible circumstances for interaction, and observe whether the subjects would engage in misconduct." He paused, then added, "They did. Within 16 days of arriving, I was arrested, on fabricated charges, with planted evidence." Murmurs grew louder. Someone near the back whispered, "No way." Someone else cursed under their breath. Sarah nodded. "Mr. Grant, were you ever involved in a drug exchange?" "Never." "Were the drugs found in your car placed there with your knowledge?" "No. They were added after I was detained." "Do you have any evidence to support that?" "I do now." From his suit pocket, Elijah pulled out a small device, a recording unit. He handed it to Sarah, who plugged it into a speaker system set on the table. "Your Honor, this recording was recovered from a secondary wire Elijah wore during the arrest, not disclosed to the arresting officers." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Play it." Audio begins. Monroe's voice, muffled but clear. "He's too clean, but whatever. Plant the stuff and write it up. He'll fold like the rest." Lawson, laughing. "And if he doesn't, who cares? No one checks the cameras. That rookie lawyer won't know what hit her." Monroe, "You think he's important?" Lawson, "Important people don't get arrested in this zip code." Audio ends. Silence. Total. Then came the explosion. The gallery erupted. Gasps, curses, a shout of, "They set him up!" Cameras flashed. One juror dropped their pen. Judge McMillan slammed her gavel 3 times. "Order! Sit down, everyone! Sit down!" Monroe was frozen. Lawson's face had turned chalk white. Prosecutor Bell looked like he had swallowed glass. Sarah stepped forward. "Your Honor, in light of this recording and supporting documentation, the defense moves for all charges to be dismissed and for immediate investigation into the conduct of Detectives Lawson and Monroe." The judge didn't respond immediately. She looked at the defendant, then the jury, then the 2 officers who now looked very, very small. "Elijah Grant," she finally said, her voice firm, "you are free to go." The moment hit like a wave. People stood and clapped before remembering they were in court. Cameras flashed. One reporter stood and immediately began live streaming. Elijah stood, calm, dignified. He didn't smile, but his eyes were bright. He turned toward Monroe and Lawson. "You laughed," he said, softly but loud enough for the room to hear. "And now it's your turn to answer." Neither man spoke. Outside the courtroom, news alerts exploded. Breaking, FBI official reveals undercover sting at corrupt police trial. Inside, Elijah walked back to his seat. No cuffs, no chains, just silence following him like an echo of justice. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the energy didn't fade. It clung to the walls like static electricity. Reporters shouted into microphones outside, while inside, the prosecution sat paralyzed. The judge had recessed for an hour, but no one moved. Not really. Elijah Grant remained seated, calm, observing. Sergeant Monroe and Detective Lawson sat to his right, across the aisle, no longer speaking to each other. Their swagger had drained away. Their faces were pale, eyes darting. Sarah Kim stood beside Elijah, whispering with one of the FBI agents who had appeared from nowhere the moment the recording played. 2 more agents stood at the back of the courtroom, hands folded, earpieces visible. Judge McMillan returned and resumed her seat with a quiet authority. She didn't even need to bang her gavel. The room fell still. The court will now hear final procedural matters related to the defense's motion, she said. Mr. Bell? Prosecutor Travis Bell rose, his face flushed. He'd spent the last hour making desperate phone calls, probably to his boss, maybe to Internal Affairs, maybe even to the mayor's office. Your Honor, the state concedes the dismissal of all charges against Mr. Grant. That was it. No apology, no statement, just bureaucratic retreat. Sarah didn't gloat. She simply nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. But the judge wasn't finished. She turned to the 2 officers. Detective Lawson, Sergeant Monroe, stand. They hesitated, then slowly rose. You are hereby remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals, Judge McMillan said. You are being detained pending formal charges including perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice. Gasps rippled again. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was real. 2 U.S. Marshals approached. Lawson's shoulders tensed. Monroe's lips parted like he was about to argue, but he didn't. The agents pulled their hands behind their backs and clicked on cuffs. You can't do this, Monroe hissed, panic creeping into his voice. This is political. You made it political, the judge replied. And now it's criminal. Click, click, cuffs secured. Sarah exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 2 full days. Elijah stayed still, watching. The judge turned to him next. Mr. Grant, you are free to go. This court owes you more than an apology. Elijah stood. With respect, Your Honor, I don't need an apology. I need accountability. And I believe today was a step in the right direction. A beat of silence. Then the judge nodded once, curt and respectful. Elijah gathered his files. Sarah walked beside him. Reporters were already waiting outside. As he approached the courthouse doors, Monroe shouted from across the room, voice cracking, desperate. You set us up! Elijah paused, turned slowly, looked at him. No, he said. You set yourselves up. I just gave you the opportunity. And with that, he pushed open the courtroom doors. The flash of cameras was blinding. Dozens of reporters surged forward. Mr. Grant, were you undercover the entire time? Sir, is this part of a national investigation? Will other officers face consequences? Elijah didn't answer. He kept walking, calm, composed. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. An FBI agent opened the door. Before stepping in, Elijah turned back and looked at the courthouse. Not as a victim. Not as a man who barely survived, but as someone who changed everything. Back inside, Monroe sat, hands cuffed, breathing in sharp bursts. Lawson stared at the ground, silent for once. The courtroom felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Bell remained at his desk, unsure what to do, how to spin it, how to survive it. His career had just taken a bullet to the chest. And Sarah Kim? She walked out of that courtroom no longer a rookie, no longer just a name buried at the bottom of a legal directory. She walked out with purpose, with pride, next to the man who taught her how the truth doesn't scream. It waits, it watches, and then it detonates. The sun was setting behind the courthouse when the final chapter began. Inside, the air had shifted. Not with chaos, not with anger, but with clarity. Truth hung in the room like light after a storm, exposing everything once hidden in shadow. The jury returned to the box one final time, not to deliberate guilt, but to witness resolution. Elijah Grant sat quietly at the defense table. Uncuffed, unshaken. He wasn't looking at the judge, or the prosecution, or even the gallery, now packed with community members, law students, local press, and federal agents. He was looking at Monroe and Lawson. The two disgraced officers sat slumped in their chairs, wrists still cuffed. No badges, no guns, no armor of authority. Just uniforms that now looked like costumes, symbols of power turned hollow. Judge McMillan's voice cut through the room like a blade. This court finds that Elijah Grant was unlawfully detained, falsely charged, and the victim of a deliberate act of criminal conspiracy. She turned to the jury. You are dismissed with the court's deepest gratitude. Your patience and attention during these proceedings will not be forgotten. One juror, a woman in her 60s, nodded with mist in her eyes. Another clapped once before stopping himself, remembering where he was. The judge continued. Due to the nature of this case and the evidence provided under federal seal, a full investigation will commence immediately into the practices of this precinct. Then she turned her gaze to the two men at the center of it all. Detective Lawson, Sergeant Monroe, you are hereby remanded to federal custody and will be transported to Washington, D.C., where formal charges will be brought under federal statute. The charges include, but are not limited to, obstruction of justice, perjury, falsifying evidence, conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, and misconduct in public office. Lawson didn't speak. He couldn't. Monroe, however, snapped. You think this ends with us? We're just the ones who got caught. Everyone in that department plays dirty. The judge didn't blink. Then they'll be next. The room tensed. The system, once untouchable, was now turning on itself. U.S. Marshals stepped forward. Lawson didn't resist. Monroe cursed under his breath but didn't fight. The sound of chains and footsteps echoed like a verdict older than the courtroom itself. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks out the front door in handcuffs. As they were led away, Elijah rose to his feet. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because everyone now knew exactly who he was and what had just happened. Sarah Kim joined him. She looked exhausted, exhilarated, and forever changed. When she extended her hand, Elijah shook it. Thank you, she said quietly, for trusting me. He smiled. You didn't just win a case. You exposed a system. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps outside, but Elijah didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't give interviews. He didn't tell his story. He let the truth speak for itself. By nightfall, headlines flooded every media outlet. FBI sting uncovers police corruption in local department. 2 officers arrested after framing federal agent. Elijah Grant, the man who let himself be framed to take down the dirty cops. Online forums exploded. Civil rights attorneys called it a landmark moment. Local residents demanded further investigations. The story wasn't just a local scandal. It was becoming a national reckoning. But Elijah? He was gone by morning. No public statement, no press tour. Just a man walking back into the shadows where he'd come from. For the people who watched the trial, for the jury who sat through the lies, for Sarah Kim who stood when it felt impossible. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was personal. It was justice, served cold and clean. And it would echo for years. Because sometimes, the man in handcuffs isn't the criminal. Sometimes, he's the one cleaning house. And the laughter you hear in the courtroom, it always stops when the truth walks in.